At 9:58 on the morning of March 3, 1943, Major Paul Gunn was seated inside the cockpit of a B-25 bomber called Margaret, watching the horizon of the Bismarck Sea suddenly roll hard to the left. His aircraft was moving at 200 miles per hour, but altitude was not on his side. He was flying just 50 feet above the surface of the water, low enough to clearly see the white crests of the waves, low enough for salty spray to streak across the windshield. Through the mist ahead loomed a Japanese destroyer. It was a 2,000-ton mass of steel, armed to the teeth with anti-aircraft guns built for one purpose: destroying planes like his. According to the flight manual, this mission was pure suicide. The manual insisted that a medium bomber should operate at 8,000 feet, releasing bombs from a steady, level approach. The manual warned that attacking a warship head-on at mast height was a mathematical certainty of death. Paul Gunn ignored the manual. His focus was on the trigger switch beneath his thumb. He wasn't peering through a bomb sight. Instead, he aimed through a basic iron ring fixed to the aircraft's nose. He waited as the destroyer swelled in his view. He could make out Japanese sailors racing across the deck. He saw the barrels of their 25mm autocannons rotating, lining up directly with his cockpit. The distance collapsed rapidly: 1,000 yards, then 800. Engineers back in California had insisted this plan would fail. They warned that firing the weapon system he had installed in the nose would generate recoil strong enough to shatter the glass, warp the aluminum frame, and possibly choke the engines. They dismissed his idea as a mechanic's fever dream. They laughed at the salvaged junkyard springs he used to soak up the shock. Gunn tightened his grip on the yoke. He was neither a test pilot nor an engineer. He was a 43-year-old father whose wife and 4 children were wasting away inside a Japanese prison camp in Manila. He pulled the trigger. The nose of the B-25 didn't simply fire, it erupted. 8.50 caliber machine guns unleashed at once. That meant 120 rounds tearing forward every single second. The recoil slammed into the airframe like a high-speed collision. The bomber shook violently, the rivets screamed, and the cockpit flooded with the sharp scent of cordite. But the glass held. The springs did their job. Below, the Japanese destroyer didn't disappear in smoke. Instead, it started coming apart, ripped open by what looked like a chainsaw forged from solid lead. To understand why a 43-year-old major flew a bomber as if it were a fighter, you need to check the scoreboard. By late 1942, the United States Army Air Forces were losing. They were losing because the war had become a math problem that simply didn't balance. Their doctrine depended on the B-17 Flying Fortress and the Norden bombsight. Generals in Washington believed that a B-17 flying at 20,000 feet could drop a bomb directly into a pickle barrel. That was the phrase used to sell the war to the public: pickle barrel accuracy. It sounded impressive in newsreels. In reality, it was a catastrophe. In the Pacific, the targets weren't factories or train yards that stayed in one place. The targets were ships, Japanese destroyers and troop transports racing across the ocean at 30 knots, constantly zigzagging. When a B-17 released a bomb from 20,000 feet, that bomb needed nearly 40 seconds to reach the water. In those 40 seconds, a Japanese captain could alter course, light a cigarette, and calmly watch the bomb fall half a mile away, splashing harmlessly into the sea. The numbers were embarrassing. During the first year of the war, high-altitude bombers scored hits on moving ships less than 1% of the time. They were burning millions of gallons of aviation fuel just to kill fish. At the same time, the Japanese were operating what became known as the Tokyo Express, a non-stop flow of fast convoys pushing thousands of troops into New Guinea. They reinforced their garrisons at La and Salamaua, slowly assembling a fortified wall north of Australia. If they landed enough soldiers, they would seize the airstrips. If they controlled the airstrips, they could bomb Australia into surrender. The Allied commander in the Southwest Pacific, General George Kenney, read the reports and recognized the reality. Heavy bombers were useless against shipping. He didn't need a scalpel working from 5 miles up. He needed a sledgehammer that could strike at point-blank range. Kenney had a problem. He had no purpose-built attack aircraft. What he did have was the B-25 Mitchell. The Mitchell was a solid airplane, a medium bomber, fast and tough, but it had been designed for the wrong kind of war. It featured a glass nose where a bombardier sat on a small stool, peering through a finely calibrated optical sight. Its few light machine guns were meant for defense, mostly aimed to the rear to discourage fighters. It was a defensive weapons platform, built to drop its bombs and then escape. Kenny needed an aircraft that charged into combat. He needed a destroyer of commerce. That's where Paul Irvin Gunn entered the story. The men called him Pappy because at 43 years old, he was ancient by aviation standards. Most pilots in the Pacific were 21-year-old kids who had learned to fly over Iowa cornfields just months earlier. Gunn had been flying since the 1920s. He had served as a naval aviator and later worked as a civilian airline pilot in the Philippines. He understood the jungle, the islands, and the machines that flew over them. But Papy Gun wasn't driven by patriotism or abstract duty. He was driven by a cold, focused rage that unsettled younger officers. When the Japanese invaded the Philippines in 1941, Gunn escaped in a damaged airplane. His wife Polly and their 4 children did not. They were captured in Manila and imprisoned in the Santo Tomas internment camp. Gunn knew what happened inside those camps. He knew about hunger, disease, and cruelty. Every day the war continued was another day his children might not survive. He did not have time for doctrine. He had no time for test flights or committee debates. He walked straight into General Kenny's office in Brisbane, Australia, and pitched an idea that sounded completely insane. He wanted to take the B-25, remove the bombardier, rip out the bomb sight, and convert the glass nose into a gun compartment. He planned to install 4 fixed .50 caliber machine guns in the nose, add 2 more in external side pods, and lock the top turret facing forward. He wanted to transform a medium bomber into a flying shotgun, packing more forward firepower than a tank. General Kenny was desperate enough to agree. He gave Gunn a hangar in Brisbane and told him to make it work. When the engineers at North American Aviation, the company that designed and built the B-25, heard about the idea, they didn't just reject it. They laughed. They sent memos explaining basic physics to the baffled major. The nose of a B-25 was essentially a greenhouse, a lightweight aluminum frame holding sheets of plexiglass. It was designed to support 1 man and a 15-pound bomb sight, nothing more. The engineers laid out the numbers behind the Browning M2.50 caliber machine gun. This wasn't a rifle. It was heavy industrial machinery. Each gun weighed 64 pounds and fired a finger-sized bullet at 2,900 feet per second. The recoil force from a single gun was enormous. Gunn wanted to mount 4 of them in the nose. The calculations were straightforward. Fire 4.50s at once from that position and the recoil would rip the rivets apart. The nose section would literally tear off the fuselage. Even if the frame somehow survived, the vibration would instantly shatter the glass, blinding the pilot. And even if the glass stayed intact, the added weight of the guns and thousands of rounds of ammunition would push the center of gravity so far forward that the aircraft would be uncontrollable. It would pitch nose down the moment it left the runway. They called it the suicide box. They warned Kenny that Gunn would kill his pilots before they ever encountered the Japanese. Gunn read the reports. Then he threw them away. He wasn't building an airplane to pass an inspection. He was building one to sink the ships supplying the prison guards in Manila. He went scavenging through scrap piles at the Royal Australian Air Force Base. He wasn't looking for aircraft-grade aluminum. He was searching for steel. He found worn shock absorbers, thick industrial springs, and felt pads used in heavy machinery. Gunn's idea was simple. The engineers had assumed a rigid mount. Bolt the guns directly to the airframe and yes, the structure would tear itself apart. But Gunn had no intention of bolting them down. He planned to let them float. He designed a spider mount, an odd framework of steel tubes and plates that suspended the 4 heavy guns in the center of the nose. The guns sat in a cradle that could slide backward under recoil. Behind that cradle, he installed the scavenged springs and shock absorbers, built to soak up the force before it reached the airframe. Absorbers. The concept was that when the guns fired, the entire assembly would recoil backward into the springs, which would absorb the energy before it reached the fragile aluminum structure. It was pure garage engineering. It was crude. It was ugly. It added hundreds of pounds of useless weight to the nose. The younger mechanics in the hangar stared at the device and shook their heads. They jokingly called it Pappy's recoil toy. Some whispered that the old man had finally lost his mind. You couldn't just guess at aerodynamics. You couldn't fix a center of gravity problem with a welding torch and a hunch. But Gunn kept going. He cut openings in the plexiglass for the gun barrels. He ran ammunition chutes through the navigator's compartment, turning the floor into a flowing river of brass shell casings. He bolted blister packs onto the fuselage skin, adding 2 more guns just beneath the cockpit windows. By the time he finished, the B-25 strafer looked like something stitched together in a nightmare. Guns protruded from nearly every surface. It was nose-heavy, ugly, and completely unauthorized. The official B-25 Mitchell manual listed its maximum armament as adequate for defense. Papy Gun had added enough firepower to slice a building in half. Now there was only one thing left to prove: whether it could fly without tearing itself apart. On the morning of the first test flight, the airfield at Brisbane was silent, the kind of silence that comes before an execution. The ground crews stood back with crossed arms, watching the strange, nose-heavy machine taxi toward the end of the runway. The engineers from North American Aviation had already submitted their reports. They had washed their hands of the experiment. They claimed the center of gravity was now so far forward that the nose gear would collapse on touchdown, or the aircraft would simply refuse to lift off. They warned that if Major Gunn fired the guns in midair, the vibration would shake the instrument panel loose, leaving the pilot blind inside his own smoke. To them, this wasn't innovation. It was $1 million of government equipment being driven into the ground by a madman. Papy Gun sat alone in the cockpit. No co-pilot. No crew. He wasn't willing to gamble anyone else's life on a theory. He pushed the throttles forward. The Wright Cyclone engines thundered, 3,400 horsepower straining against the brakes. The aircraft shuddered. It felt heavy and sluggish, like a cement truck struggling to move. He released the brakes. The B-25 rolled down the runway. It resisted flight. The nose felt glued to the tarmac, dragged down by steel guns, ammunition, and massive iron mounts. The runway end rushed closer. The engineers watched, expecting blown tires or a violent crash into the dirt. At the very last moment, Gunn hauled back on the yoke. The nose creaked upward. The wheels cleared the ground by inches. The strafer was airborne. He began to climb. 2,000 feet and turned toward the coast. This was the real test. Flying the overweight machine was one thing. Pulling the trigger was something else entirely. Gunn leveled out over open water. He armed the system. His thumb hovered over the solenoid switch on the control wheel. He wasn't simply firing guns, he was setting off a controlled explosion inside the aircraft itself. He pressed the switch. The reaction was instant and frightening. The airplane physically slowed in midair. The recoil from 8.50 caliber machine guns firing at the same time acted like a brake, ripping knots off his airspeed. Inside the cockpit, the noise was overwhelming, a non-stop jackhammer roar that drowned out the engines. The air filled with the acrid smell of burning powder. The floor vibrated violently beneath his boots. But the nose held. The glass stayed intact. Gunn's spider mount, that ugly tangle of scrap metal springs and hydraulic shocks, was doing exactly what he had hoped. It absorbed the savage recoil, allowing the guns to slide backward by tiny fractions of an inch, consuming the energy before it could tear rivets from the aluminum skin. He watched the tracer rounds streak into the sea. They didn't scatter like water from a loose hose. They converged. At 1,000 yards, the streams of lead merged into a tight, focused cone of destruction. This wasn't area fire. It was precision drilling. Gunn brought the plane back down and taxied into the hangar. The mechanics who had mocked his recoil toy gathered around the aircraft. They saw the black soot streaking the nose. They smelled cordite in the air. But they saw no cracked glass. No warped panels. No popped rivets. The crazy old man had done it. He had built a gunship that flatly contradicted the manufacturer's physics. But Gunn knew the weapon alone wasn't enough. A gun without a finishing blow was useless. The .50s could shred a ship's deck, slaughter crews, and ignite fires, but they couldn't sink a 6,000-ton transport. That required bombs. And dropping bombs from 50 feet was an excellent way to destroy yourself. This was the second half of Gunn's impossible equation. He had to retrain pilots who were taught to fly straight and level at 8,000 feet to fly like lunatics. He called it skip bombing. The idea wasn't new. It was the same principle as skipping a flat stone across a pond. Throw the stone steeply and it sinks. Throw it low and hard, nearly parallel to the surface, and it skips. Gunn wanted to do that with a 500-pound bomb. The physics were simple. The execution was terrifying. To make a bomb skip, the aircraft had to fly at 200 miles per hour, perfectly level, no higher than 50 feet above the water. Drop it too high, and the bomb would dive straight into the sea. Drop it too low. Dropped it too low, the splash from the bomb striking the water could rise up and clip the tail, sending the aircraft crashing into the sea. And then there was the explosion itself. A 500-pound bomb produces a lethal blast that reaches hundreds of feet upward. Released from just 50 feet, the shockwave would tear the wings off the bomber before it could escape. The solution was a delayed fuse. Gunn and his armorers set the timers to 4 to 5 seconds. The bomb would hit the water, skip across the surface like a flat stone, slam into the side of a Japanese ship, sink below the waterline, and only then detonate. Those few seconds gave the pilot just enough time to pull up, push the engines to emergency power, and clear the blast radius. The training was merciless. Gunn found an old wreck, the SS Pruth, stranded on a reef off the coast near Port Moresby. It became the most bombed chunk of scrap metal in the entire Pacific. The pilots hated the technique at first. It felt wrong. Every instinct drilled into them during flight school screamed to climb. The ocean screamed past beneath them, a blurred streak in their peripheral vision. They had to fight the urge to stare at the water. They had to lock their attention completely on the target. Gunn never let up. He flew with them. He sat in the co-pilot's seat, shouting over the roar of the engines, forcing them lower. Lower. Get lower. If you aren't leaving wakes with your propellers, you're too damn high. This was where the strafer concept finally clicked. The pilots understood why the guns mattered. In a traditional bombing run, the aircraft is a helpless target for anti-aircraft fire. Ship gunners get a clean, uninterrupted shot at an incoming bomber. But with the gun modifications, the bomber shoots back. As the pilot begins the attack run from 2 miles out, he opens fire with the nose guns. He rakes the deck. He kills the anti-aircraft crews. He smashes the bridge. He forces the captain to duck for cover. By the time the bomber is close enough to release the bomb, the ship isn't fighting back. It's pinned down by a solid wall of lead. The B-25 was no longer just a bomber. It was a suppression weapon that delivered a knockout blow. General Kenny saw the training results and acted immediately. He ordered every available B-25 converted. There was no time to ship them back to factories in California. The work had to be done in the jungle. Gunn set up a makeshift production line in the dirt at Port Moresby. It was organized chaos. Mechanics labored around the clock, ripping glass noses off aircraft, welding steel plates into place, cutting openings for gun barrels, and bolting on the heavy spider mounts. They scavenged parts from wrecked planes. They stole metal from supply dumps. They worked through tropical downpours and malaria outbreaks. They weren't building beautiful airplanes. They were building street fighters. By late February 1943, Gunn had a squadron of these hybrids ready. Were ugly. The paint didn't match. The noses were blackened with soot. But the pilots were different. They moved differently. They weren't high-altitude bus drivers anymore. They were hunters. They knew they were carrying a weapon the Japanese didn't understand and had no answer for. They had practiced on the wreck of the Pruth until they could skip a bomb through a single porthole at 200 miles per hour. But shooting at a dead hulk was one thing. Attacking a destroyer that shot back was something else entirely. The test came sooner than anyone expected. Intelligence reports began filtering in from coastwatchers and codebreakers. The Japanese were on the move. A massive convoy had assembled at Rabaul, the primary Japanese fortress in the region. 8 destroyers. 8 large troop transports. Thousands of soldiers. They were heading for Huon Gulf. This wasn't a resupply run. It was an invasion. If those troops landed at La, the Allied foothold in New Guinea would be wiped out. The Tokyo Express was running again, and this time it was carrying an entire army. Then the weather turned. A tropical cyclone rolled into the Solomon Sea, throwing up walls of rain and pressing the clouds down low. The Japanese commanders were counting on it. They knew the Americans depended on high-altitude bombing. They knew B-17s couldn't find ships through thick cloud cover. They believed the storm would hide their movement, letting them slip through the damp silence and land their troops without losing a single man. They were right about the B-17s. The flying fortresses were grounded or flying blind, unable to see the ocean below. The Japanese assumed they were safe. What they didn't know was what had been happening in the mud at Port Moresby. They didn't know the Americans had stopped looking down from the stratosphere. They didn't know a new kind of aircraft was waiting on the runway, engines idling, ready for the signal. These planes didn't need clear skies at 20,000 feet. They liked the clouds. They liked the low ceiling. It gave them cover. It let them come in at wave-top height, invisible until the last moment. On March 1, a lone B-24 Liberator on patrol caught sight of the convoy through a brief opening in the storm. The radio report went straight back to headquarters. 14 ships heading west. The position was marked. The speed was calculated. Their course pointed directly into the Bismarck Sea. The trap was closing. General Kenny studied the map. He read the weather officer's report. The storm was expected to break in 2 days. Then he looked at Papy Gun. Welding and testing were finished. The theory of recoil springs and skip bombing was about to be tested against 16 warships and 7,000 men ready to die for their emperor. The order went out to the squadrons. Clearing weather predicted. Maximum effort. Crews gathered inside sweltering tents. They studied ship silhouettes. Of the Japanese destroyers Asashio, Arashio, Tanaka's fast, modern warships armed with 5-inch guns and dense batteries of 25mm autocannons. The pilots studied the blurry reconnaissance photos. Then they looked at their own aircraft, stub-nosed with machine guns, heavy with bombs. There was no fallback plan. If Gunn's insane idea failed, the B-25s would be swatted from the sky and the Japanese army would flood into New Guinea. On the morning of March 3, the clouds began to break. The Bismarck Sea lay flat and gray. The Japanese convoy steamed forward in a tight defensive ring, destroyers circling the transports, guns manned, eyes searching the sky above, waiting for the B-17s. They were looking up. They should have been looking down. At 10 a.m., the Battle of the Bismarck Sea stopped being a battle and became an execution. The Japanese destroyer captains were veterans. They understood American air power. They expected the distant drone of heavy engines at 20,000 feet. They expected to spot tiny black specks releasing bombs that would take 40 seconds to fall. Their helmsmen stood ready to swing hard to port or starboard, calmly dodging the ordnance. They watched the clouds, waiting for the B-17s. They were playing chess against an opponent who moved slowly and predictably. They didn't realize Pappy Gun had overturned the board and drawn a knife. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't sound, it was shape. Out of the haze on the horizon came a mass of aircraft, but not the high-altitude dots the Japanese were trained to see. These planes were skimming the surface, flying so low their propellers kicked spray from the sea. At the front were Australian Beaufighters, heavy twin-engine fighters with 4 cannons in the nose. They struck first, acting as the suppression force, ripping across the decks of the destroyers and forcing gun crews to keep their heads down. Then came the B-25s. The strafers. The 90th Squadron. The 38th Group. They advanced line abreast, a solid wall of aluminum tearing across the water at 200 miles per hour. Inside the lead bomber, the pilot locked onto the destroyer Horatio. It was a 2,000-ton steel Predator bristling with weapons. Under normal circumstances, the destroyer wins this fight. Its 5-inch guns could erase a bomber from 3 miles away. Its 25mm autocannons could shred an airframe at a mile. But Horatio couldn't bring its main guns to bear on a target flying 10 feet above the waves. The barrels simply couldn't depress that low. And the autocannon crews were suddenly staring straight into something they had never faced before. The B-25 pilot flipped the solenoid switch. This was the moment the North American Aviation engineers had warned about. This was supposed to be the instant the nose tore itself free. The pilot squeezed the trigger. The recoil spring system, that ugly, improvised mass of junkyard springs and shock absorbers, slammed backward. The entire airframe groaned under the strain. The cockpit shook so hard the instruments smeared into blurs. But the rivets held. The glass held. And from the nose of the aircraft erupted a solid stream of armor-piercing incendiary fire. 8.50 caliber machine guns firing at once create a density of fire that's hard to imagine. It isn't just bullets, it's force. The rounds didn't merely strike Horatio. They took it apart. They punched through the steel of the bridge. They shredded the thin plating around the gun tubs. They turned the deck into a killing ground. The Japanese gunners never had a chance to aim. They were cut down where they stood. The recoil system worked so well the pilots could hold the trigger for 3, 4, even 5 seconds at a time. They walked the stream of fire from bow to stern, washing the ship the way you hose down a driveway. But the machine guns were only the can opener. The bomb was the blade. The pilot stayed on course until the destroyer filled his entire windscreen. At 300 yards, he was close enough to see the fear on the faces of the men on the bridge. He released the bomb. A 500-pound cylinder of high explosive dropped from the bay. It didn't fall, it flew. It struck the water at a shallow angle, skipping across the surface like a flat stone thrown by a giant. It bounced once. Twice. 3 times. Then it slammed into the side of Horatio right at the waterline. The delay fuse began counting. 1 second. 2 seconds. The B-25 roared directly over the ship's mast, the pilot hauling back on the stick, engine screaming. 3 seconds. 4 seconds. The bomb detonated. The blast didn't rise upward. It drove inward. It tore a hole the size of a garage door through the destroyer's hull. The shock wave lifted the 2,000-ton ship clear of the sea. Boiler rooms flooded instantly. Horatio snapped its spine. The same scene unfolded again and again across the convoy. The Japanese formation collapsed. The troop transports, fat, slow ships packed with thousands of soldiers, were suddenly naked. They had depended on the destroyers for protection. Now the destroyers were burning. Pappy Gun's pilots turned toward the transports like wolves breaking into a flock. They set up their attack runs. For these softer targets, bombs weren't even necessary. The .50 calibers were enough. The heavy rounds punched through unarmored hulls. They ignited fuel drums stacked on deck. They set off ammunition crates packed in the holds. One B-25 pilot, Major Ed Larner, flew so low he had to pull up to avoid smashing into the mast of a transport. As he passed overhead, his tail gunner raked the deck from behind. The ship was the Kyakusei Maru. It was loaded with aviation fuel. When the skip bombs struck, the vessel didn't merely sink, it vaporized. A fireball climbed nearly 1,000 feet into the sky. The B-25 flying behind Larner went straight through the fireball. The heat blistered the paint on its wings. The pilot emerged on the far side alive, rattled, but still airborne. The commerce destroyer concept was working terrifyingly well. Skip bombing was proving lethally precise. At high altitude, a 10% hit rate was considered outstanding. At mast height, the B-25s were achieving close to a 50% hit rate. They weren't missing. They were placing bombs directly into the engine rooms of moving ships. The Japanese captains tried to maneuver. They zigzagged. They turned hard. It didn't matter. You can't outrun an airplane doing 200 knots. The B-25 simply circled, waited for a ship to commit to a turn, then came in from the broadside and killed it. By noon, the Bismarck Sea was a graveyard. The destroyer Toketsuke's lay dead in the water, sinking. A Sashio burned from bow to stern. All 8 transports had been hit. Most were sinking or already gone. The surface of the sea was coated with oil and debris, and thousands of struggling survivors. The B-25s ran out of bombs, but they didn't leave. They came back in for strafing runs. They used the recoil spring gun systems to finish off crippled ships. They punched holes through lifeboats. They raked the debris fields. It was industrialized killing. It was war without mercy. But the pilots remembered the reports from Bataan. They remembered stories of American prisoners being executed. They remembered Pappy Gun's family in Manila. They kept firing until their gun barrels glowed red and the ammunition chutes ran dry. Back at base, the ground crews waited. They heard engines in the distance. One by one, the planes returned. They counted them. Every aircraft came back. Some were riddled with holes. Some had pieces of Japanese ship rigging tangled in their landing gear. One B-25 landed with its nose wheel crushed, not from a bad landing, but because it had clipped the smokestack of a sinking transport. The pilots climbed out of their cockpits soaked in sweat, hands shaking from adrenaline and vibration. They walked into the debrief hut and dropped their helmets on the table. General Kenny read the reports. He stared at the numbers. He could hardly believe them. In a single morning, Pappy Gun's so-called suicide boxes had inflicted more damage on the Japanese Navy than the entire 5th Air Force had managed in the previous 6 months. The high-altitude B-17s that also took part in the attack claimed a few hits. But the reconnaissance photographs told the real story. The ships had gaping holes torn into their hulls right at the waterline. The unmistakable signature of skip bombing. The decks were torn apart, the bridges smashed, that was the mark of the strafer nose. The impossible physics of the recoil system had held. The springs had soaked up the force of hundreds of thousands of rounds. The mounts hadn't cracked. The glass hadn't shattered. The engineers who had laughed, who had written long memos about center of gravity and stress fractures, had nothing to say. The equations insisted it couldn't work. The burning wreckage in the Bismarck Sea said otherwise. That night, the Tokyo Express effectively died. The Japanese high command at Rabaul was stunned. An entire division of troops was gone. Vital destroyers were lost. The sea route to reinforce New Guinea had been cut. A message went back to Tokyo: the enemy has developed a new method of bombing. It is extremely low and extremely accurate. They didn't know it was the work of a 43-year-old major armed with a welder and a grudge. They only knew that the Bismarck Sea was now closed to Japanese shipping. The victory was total. 8 transports sunk. 4 destroyers destroyed. More than 3,000 Japanese soldiers killed. The Americans lost 13 men. It was one of the most one-sided victories in naval warfare history, and it had been won by an aircraft that was never supposed to exist, using a tactic the manuals called suicide, firing through a gun mount built from scrap metal. That evening, Papy Gun walked out onto the flight line. He rested a hand on the nose of his B-25. The aluminum was cool now, coated in thick soot. He checked the springs on the gun mount. They were compressed and worn, but intact. He lit a cigarette and looked north, toward the Philippines. He had killed many men that day. He had sunk many ships. But he knew it wasn't enough. His family was still in Santo Tomas. The war was not over. He would have to build more airplanes. He would have to find more guns. He would have to sink more destroyers.
And God help anyone who told him it couldn't be done.
The silence after the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was louder than the gunfire. In the officers' clubs of Brisbane and the boardrooms of North American Aviation in California, the laughter stopped.
The recoil spring was no longer a joke.
It was doctrine. The engineers who had written pages explaining why a B-25 would tear itself apart if guns were mounted in the nose were now tasked with explaining why a mechanic working in jungle mud had outsmarted their entire design department.
They didn't send apologies. They sent draftsmen.
Teams arrived at the open-air workshop at Port Moresby, sweating in clean uniforms, clipboards in hand. They climbed over soot-stained, battle-scarred B-25s. They measured steel plate thicknesses. They sketched the ugly welded spider mounts. They pressed fingers against scavenged shock absorbers. And they began to understand that while the mathematics had said it was impossible, reality had already passed judgment. Math said it shouldn't work. The reality of combat said it was the deadliest medium bomber ever built. The factory representatives did what smart men do after they lose an argument: they stole the idea. They gathered their drawings, flew back to the United States, and went to work. When the new B-25J models rolled off the assembly lines in Kansas City, they no longer had a glass bombardier's nose. They had a solid metal nose packed with 8.50 caliber machine guns, installed at the factory using a refined version of Pappy Gun's suspension system. They called it the strafer. The manuals were rewritten.
The suicide box became standard.
Gunn never received a patent.
There were no royalties, no checks.
His reward was watching thousands of factory-built versions of his impossible airplane arrive in the Pacific to finish the work he had begun.
But Gunn wasn't done. The victory in the Bismarck Sea didn't satisfy him, it only proved he was right. His family was still in Santo Tomas. The Japanese still held the Philippines.
So he pushed further. If .50 caliber machine guns were good, he decided a cannon would be better. He took a 75mm field gun, an artillery piece meant to be towed by a truck and fired from the ground, and decided to shove it into the nose of a B-25.
The recoil from a 75mm cannon is like being hit by a freight train.
When he test-fired it, the airplane almost stopped in midair. Rivets popped. The structure screamed. But he made it work. He had built a flying tank destroyer, an aircraft that could sink a ship with a single shell from 2 miles away. He flew these monsters until his body finally began to fail.
In late 1944, over the Philippines, Gunn's luck ran out. He was shot down.
His plane crashed into the jungle. He lived, but white phosphorus burned his body.
He lost a finger.
One arm was mangled beyond repair. Flight surgeons took one look at him and grounded him permanently. His war, they said, was over. He was 45 years old, burned, crippled, and should have been on a hospital ship bound for San Francisco. Gunn ignored the doctors the same way he had ignored the engineers. He wasn't leaving until the gates of Santo Tomas were opened. He talked his way back into the air. He flew supplies. He flew reconnaissance. He flew anything with wings. When General MacArthur finally returned to the Philippines, waiting ashore at Leyte, Papy Gun was overhead, watching the ground, counting the miles to Manila.
On February 3, 1945, the nightmare ended.
The 1st Cavalry Division smashed through the gates of the Santo Tomas internment camp. Inside were 3,700 civilians barely clinging to life, skeletons surviving on less than 700 calories a day. Among them were Papy Gun and her 4 children. They had endured 3 years of starvation, disease, and brutality. When Papy Gun walked into that camp, he wasn't a legendary commerce destroyer. He was a husband and a father who had spent every waking moment of the last 3 years building a machine violent enough to save his family. He found them alive. That was the only victory that mattered. The ships on the bottom of the Bismarck Sea, the medals, the history books, none of it meant anything compared to the moment he wrapped his arms around his wife. The rage that had driven him, the cold fury that let him turn a bomber into a slaughterhouse, finally burned out. After the war, the Air Force tried to keep him. They offered promotions, a desk at the Pentagon, a chance to teach engineers.
Gunn turned it all down.
He had no interest in peacetime bureaucracy.
No interest in wearing a uniform when there was no one left to fight.
He stayed in the Philippines.
He loved the islands.
He started a civilian airline, Philippine Airlines, and went back to doing what he'd done before the world caught fire, flying people and cargo over jungle terrain, fixing engines with baling wire, landing on dirt strips that terrified younger pilots.
But men like Pappy Gun don't die quietly.
They live by machines, and eventually machines take them back.
On January 16, 1957, Gunn was flying a Beechcraft Bonanza through a storm near Manila. He was 57 years old.
He had survived the Japanese Navy, jungle crashes, and phosphorus burns. He had survived skeptics and generals.
He didn't survive the weather. The aircraft went down. Pappy Gun died instantly. His legacy doesn't sit behind glass in a museum. It's still flying.
Every time you see an A-10 Warthog, a giant gun with wings wrapped around it, you're looking at the descendant of Pappy Gun's B-25. Every time an AC-130 gunship circles a target, pouring fire from the sky, you're seeing the evolution of the strafer concept. Gunn proved that wars are won by those who adapt fastest. He proved manuals are suggestions. And he proved that a man with a welding torch and a reason to fight is more dangerous than any committee of experts. Historians talk about admirals and generals. They talk about Nimitz and MacArthur. About grand strategies and fleet movements. But the Pacific War wasn't won by arrows on a map. It was won by men like Pappy Gun and men who looked at a problem, realized the official solution would get them killed, and built a better one out of scrap metal. He turned a defensive bomber into an offensive weapon that broke the Japanese merchant fleet. He did it while everyone told him he was insane. He did it while they laughed at his recoil springs. And he did it for the simplest reason of all. He just wanted his kids back. If this story stayed with you, if you believe innovation comes from dirty hands instead of clean suits, hit that like button. It tells the algorithm these stories matter. It helps us uncover more forgotten legends like Pappy Gun. Subscribe if you haven't. We're digging through the archives every day, rescuing the stories of men and women who changed history with nothing but grit and refusal to quit. Drop a comment and tell us the wildest field modification you've ever heard of. Have you ever fixed something when experts said it was impossible? We read every comment. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being part of this community. We tell these stories so Pappy Gun never fades into silence.